Hi, so good evening everyone and welcome to the first Angular.JS Meetup for Sydney. My name is John Scott and I'll be your host tonight. We've got Daniel Nadassi from Google who has been using Angular for a while and was gracious enough to speak tonight. So we're hoping to do this each month. We'll pick a regular evening monthly, and it's going to benefit by your contributions. So if anyone's interested in speaking, whether you're working on an Angular project and you'd like to talk about it, got an interesting problem, like to discuss it, we'd love to hear from you. We may also do some shorter lightning demos as well, so if you want to come along one night and just show something cool that might only take a couple of minutes, that would be great. For that contribution, we have Angular t-shirts, the prized possession of the Angular community. We've got a box full, which is great. So if you participate, you win a prize. So I'm just going to give a quick overview of Angular, and first I need to share my screen. For the recording. Wait, there we go. Okay, so if you've come along tonight and you've heard a bit about Angular but wondering what the hell it is, then I think we'll do this each month, just give new attendees a quick overview. Daniel's talk is going to be more of a deep dive into particular use of Angular, so if you're using Angular and you want to get better at it, then that's the sort of talk for you. So what's Angular? And in answering this question, everybody kind of has their own take on what Angular is. A lot of people are drawn to it, attracted to it, and it seems to have various things that they like. So factually, it's a JavaScript framework from Google. It's about 3 years old now, and it's for building web apps. I like to think of it as a framework for building single-page web apps where you're loading your app into a single page and you've got state living in your client-side web app. One of the things that attracts people initially is it's two-way data binding. It kind of works like magic. A lot of frameworks have data binding one way, but Angular has two-way, which gives you a lot of flexibility. It does have a MVC-ish kind of framework. It does well in having you separate concerns from your views and controllers. Services sit there as singletons, and it's kind of structured to out of the box to that you build well-structured apps. Dependency injection is a key to Angular, and as you get into it, you kind of find that every function seems to be called with all the services and things that it needs. That's actually a key to making Angular apps unit testable, and this is one thing that attracted me. In a decade or two of building web apps, it's been very difficult to test them the way you might test a Java app or whatever. But amazingly, Angular apps, you can write unit tests for them and have them as part of a grown-up build system, continually testing, and kind of makes it worthwhile. So it's an open source project as well. It's run by Google. There's a team in Mountain View, but the open source community is huge. A lot of good contributions from the community, a lot of discussion on the Google group. So that's another good reason to get involved with it. Again, even though it's young, it's very, very active. So here, this is kind of the hello world to me of Angular. So what you've basically got here is a text field, and as I type into the text field, the next line, it's showing Angular's two-way data binding and inserting that name in there. So how does that work? Well, you can see the HTML just above. It's very, very simple. And another design goal, as I understand from Angular as well, is having or using HTML as a declarative way of designing your application. So you can see here we have a placeholder for a value called name. Placeholders by default in Angular are double curly braces. We have just a plain old input text field with this attribute called ngModel, and all Angular attributes are prefixed with ng. So when you see ng, you think Angular. And this defines a model called name, which is just a data value that lives inside what's called a scope in this area here. So the rest of this tag is just plain old HTML, nothing special there. We're importing Angular here as a script, and very importantly, we have another attribute here called ngout. Just by including that script, Angular will create that data model, and then wherever you want to use that placeholder, it will put it in real time. So when I saw this, I kind of went, wow, I come from recently from a jQuery background, and to do that kind of thing in jQuery, it's still simple in jQuery, but you're binding events to your input field, outputting them on the other side. This makes it a whole lot easier. Okay, and so I should say, yeah, so MVC according to Angular. So Angular calls itself an MVC framework. It has concepts of controllers, directives, which Daniel will talk about, services. Your data models are just plain old JavaScript objects for models. So there's no abstracted model layer or anything. You just design your data model to suit. Controllers are functions that you use to control what is made available to the DOM, to the view. And directives let you extend the DOM and do what you would normally think of doing with jQuery. So there's an important difference between the two of them. To me, controllers are all about just making the data model available to the view, so that you can mark up your view with those Angular templates and things, and they will magically appear. Services are really service providers, connecting to back-end servers and things like that. And all the code that you write, again, is injected with Angular's dependency injection. Angular has a very simple but great way of routing requests, local requests. So you can actually see an example here. This slide shows actually an Angular app, and everything after the hash is a route to a particular view here. So to give you a simple example, so So this app here, I have just some navigation at the top, and I've got a home view here, a list of songs, and a settings view. And the list has, for each song, it has a view of the song detail as well. So if we look at the source of that, you'll see here, so these are Angular routes. Angular route maps a local path, so /home, so that would actually appear as #/home, to a template, which is in Angular parlance is called a partial, but it's just a snippet of HTML in a HTML file. And then the controller that sets up the data for those, for that view. So when you're designing your single web page app, you're doing a lot of this route definition, and it actually makes it quite quick to mock up a fully working app as well. So I'll just show you the list, for example. So my list view here is controlled by this controller, which is just a JavaScript function that Angular picks up. And you can see what's passed to this function are the services and or services really that are required for it to run. So this is an example of Angular's dependency injection, and you'll see I have a service here that I created called page, which just sets the title, and I'm setting a scope variable here for a list of items. So this service page and model are simple ones that I've created, and if we then look at the templates, so here's a template for my, actually, I'll show you. Here's a template for the whole page. There's the page title there that gets set each time by my page page service. And I've just got links here to which will Angular will pick up as routes and show those views. And then here we have a tag called ngView. So Angular actually substitutes the content of this tag for my view. So I said before that the templates can just exist as HTML snippets inside HTML files. You can do that. What I've got here, though, this is a trick in Angular. You can actually, if you want to just have your app in one HTML file, which I have now, so so your script, all your views, all your styles, which is good just to have a single file to carry it around. You can use this trick here of actually putting them in a script tag, and you just have a different type, which is a Angular template. So this will effectively override a request to list.html. So it's good for mocking up quick and dirty apps in a single file. One more thing I want to show you as well. So Angular has some great capabilities of doing layout as well. And again, coming from jQuery, this is the kind of thing that is a lot more tedious and terse in jQuery. It's quite elegantly simple here. But what you're looking at here is, so I've just got an unordered list. There's a list item that gets repeated with this ng repeat. There's beautiful syntax here of saying item in items. So items is the name of a list that I created in my scope. Item becomes the repeat variable, I guess. And then you can see here I have two placeholders here for the item ID and the item title, and that will just grab that field from that particular object out of the array and just display it. So that's what you're seeing here. Yep, question?
Items change, that this will maybe.
Yep, so yep, as the items change, they'll just magically update as well. Yep. And I won't go into too much detail now, but if you're pulling this data from a remote server, Angular has a couple of great services, so a HTTP service and a resource service for RESTful web services. You make the request, and it brings you back what's called a promise object, which is a great concept. It's initially empty. It doesn't matter how long it takes for the request to come back for the service. As the data comes back, Angular will just realize that data is updated and will update your view. So pulling data from remote services in Angular is just beautifully simple. All right, I'm going to get a rig on so Daniel can speak, but just a couple of quick things that I really like about Angular. So there's a really good bunch of there's really good support for form validation. So you'll see here's a registration form for an app that I'm building at the moment. I've specified that this is an email field here, and doing this kind of validation on the fly and creating messages that appear and disappear like you saw underneath can all be expressed in the HTML markup. No coding required. It's just beautiful, including so if you watch the register button down below, as soon as I have filled in this form correctly, it turns green and I'm able to register. So might go through that in detail another time. If you want to learn Angular, the Angular website has a great tutorial that takes you through all the basic Angular concepts, including pulling data from a remote server with the resource service, like I mentioned. This is the one I used. It was a really good introduction to Git as well. All the milestones in the tutorial are Git branches that you just update, and all the code that you're working on just magically updates. It's great. So I recommend that. This is the Angular.JS Google group. It's extremely busy. Lots of good stuff on there. It's actually one disappointing thing about it is there's actually too much going on. Learning it, it's one of those groups I'd really like to be across in detail and contributing, but there's too much for me in my sort of normal working day to get across. But it's a great resource to search and find examples. Good bunch of people as well. People are posting problems, creating JS fiddles, for example, as examples, and people are just coming in and fixing their code for them, which is great. So really healthy community. Tools tools as well, there's a great extension for Chrome called the Angular Batarang, which gives you a good visual view into your app. So here's a screenshot of the various scopes, which I didn't talk too much about, but it's good to be able to visualize that. I really like the performance view as well. So you can actually, as your app is growing, you can actually zero in on any sort of poor performing requests and things. It's quite neat. Love this view here. So this is a visual view of all the dependencies of your services and things that you're using. So great tool. I mean, you know, using the developer tools in Chrome is kind of well, it's what I use anyway for debugging web apps. So this extension it kind of fits right in. I also use my favorite IDE at the moment is WebStorm from JetBrains. It's got good support for Angular. This guy, John Lindquist, he's done quite a few good tutorial videos as well. There's syntactical support for Angular in WebStorm. I should also mention NetBeans, especially if you come from a Java background. The most recent release, I think it's 7.3 of NetBeans, has an amazing support for HTML web apps. It has Angular and just about every other web framework that you can think of built in and ready to go. And unlike WebStorm, it has a version of WebKit sort of built into the IDE, so you can actually run your apps within the IDE and debug that way. And there's a trend with these IDEs as well to hook into Chrome and be able to live debug your apps as well. So you're updating source code and things. WebStorm does an okay job. It has an extension for Chrome, but NetBeans has a fantastic one, and I think it actually works better. So two good options there as well. And lastly, there's an Angular.JS YouTube channel, like I mentioned. Hope we'll get our meetup videos on there, but I've been following these, and there's some really good tech talk here from mainly from the meetups that happen in Mountain View. So, any questions while Daniel sets up?
Browser compatibility.
So it's really a framework for HTML5 apps. So you kind of not limited, but that's the world that Angular kind of works in. The app that I'm building, I've had to use the HTML5 shim to get Internet Explorer working. I'm also targeting mobile web apps, or mobile web as well. So iPhone and Android seem to work okay. Windows Phone 7 and 8 doesn't work at all yet. I've got to figure out what that is. But that should work. I mean, you know, I'm not targeting IE6. You know, I'm not that much of a sadist, and it seems to work. Okay. Alrighty, there we go. Sorry that took so long, everyone. Alright, so my name's Daniel Darcy. I'm going to say a little bit about what we've done on with Angular.js on my team here at Google. My background's a bit diverse. I've been at Google for about 5 years, working on a variety of different things, not only web development, also back-endy stuff, ads, apps. And right now, what the team is developing is a application for
large chain businesses to manage their locations on basically Google Maps and ads. So it's officially known as the Google Places for Business Bulk Upload Tool. It might be known as the Google Places for Business Bulk Location Management Tool. I don't actually remember. The branding guidelines at Google are rather strict. For the purposes of this talk, I'm going to call it Location Manager because that's what we refer to it as, and it tends to be a lot easier to say. So also, if you have a peek, I'm going to show you the app, and if you have a peek into our CSS and so on, you'll see LM dash like everywhere as our namespace, and that's why it's LM dash. So let me show you a quick demo of what the app is, so you get an idea. I'm going to do demos. Do one just so you get a feel for it, and then I'll talk about some of the Angular concepts, and then I'll come back and sort of point various things out to you. So I need to do that, and I need to jump into here, and then full screen this. Okay, great. That was okay. As you can see, the screen resolution is tripping me up a bit. Basically, the user will see a list of locations. I haven't shown you the loading experience. They can manage them in bulk. There's a spreadsheet import interface for people to import things en masse into our interface. There's a verification process so that these things can actually appear on maps. And then there's various interfaces to like do modification of locations and so on. We've got sorting. We've got search as you type, you know, and then, oh, that wasn't a very good example. There you go. And things like that. So, you know, the sort of things you'd expect in the kind of web app where you want to, like, manage things in en masse. So, you know, if you want to modify the brand name of 4,000 different locations at once, you can do that. And then when you do that, it enters a queue that gets synced up with the server and so on and so forth. So that's the basic idea. I won't go into too much detail. All of this is built using Angular.js and a combination of Google technologies. Most of the client stuff is open source, so I'm going to talk a little bit about how this interacts with some of the other stuff we've been using as well. Oh, you can also see quite clearly that it's a test account, which is why it has so much erroneous data in it and duplicates and so on and so forth. Okay, back into the presentation. All right, so first of all, why did we choose Angular.js? I'm actually curious at this point, how many people in the room are currently using Angular.js for a project? Okay, so maybe between a third and a half. So presumably some of the rest of you are just considering using AngularJS, or your teams are considering using AngularJS. Originally, the motivating factor for us looking for a new technology to build our front end in was that we hate Git. How many of you have used Git? Okay, so not very many of you. It's an incredibly painful experience for a variety of reasons. There's some good things about the Git technology. As in the particular project we were dealing with it in, we had a lot of legacy code built up. The compilation times for Git, because Git cross-compiles from Java to JavaScript, were taking an immense amount of time. The abstractions that Git imposes in Java were incredibly painful for us, and so on and so forth. So this isn't a talk about bagging Git, though I'm more than happy to talk about that afterwards. But that was kind of the motivation for us, looking for something simpler, more lightweight, entirely JavaScript and HTML, and that was kind of the forcing function for us to choose something new. In terms of why Angular in particular, there's obviously a lot of other client technologies that you could be looking at. Knockout.js is quite similar in terms of its data binding model and things like that. Then you've got things like Backbone and so on, and many of these are very good technologies in their own right. The reason we chose Angular in our narcissistic way was because it was developed in Google. So that meant that if something went wrong, we could talk to the Angular team and say, hey, fix this, you know, because we're trying to be early adopters of your technology. We joined Angular in the v0.9 days. I think 0.9.19 was the first version we tried out, and it was an interesting time. I'm very happy that Angular 1 has come out, and I'll point out a few things as I go along about how much Angular 1 has improved. The first one I notice is the templates thing that you were shown earlier, where you could have little inline templates that you could then include in your code. That wasn't available at the time in any meaningful sense. And certainly not for directives, which is one of the big things. So I'm going to go into a bit more detail first up about how the scopes and compilation thing works. And the reason for this is that if you want to hack something up quickly in Angular, it's really pretty straightforward to kind of read the tutorials and get a vibe for how things work, copy and paste some code, get the two-way data binding, and sort of have like ng model equals bar to have an input field take its value from some other variable you've got stored elsewhere. But if you want to do anything substantial in terms of writing reusable widgets that you can use in different places in your app, or figuring out how to optimize some of the things that Angular does. Angular can be a little bit memory intensive if you don't use it correctly. Then having an understanding of these things really helps you. So first up, Angular.JS has a compiler and a runtime. I should say that all of this is taken from the Angular docs pretty much directly, so I can point you to the places in the docs where this comes from at the end of the talk. So Angular has a compiler and a runtime, and as Mark was saying earlier, the first thing that happens when Angular gets into your code, when the script loads up, you put a script tag in your code, it sees the ng@at tag at some point in your DOM, and then it decides to climb the tree. So there's a stage where it runs over the entirety of your DOM structure and performs some analysis and some pre-computations in order to sort of set up the infrastructure needed for Angular. Yeah? The Angular compiler runs on the DOM content load event, I think it said. There's always cross-browser issues in these things, so I hesitate to say what it means, but I'm pretty sure it means that it's when the entire DOM is there.
Just let's use that after the JavaScript one. Versions of JavaScript. Does it work with JavaScript, or is it completely JavaScript, its own JavaScript engine?
No. Angular.js needs JavaScript support. It's yeah.
So it works with whatever version of JavaScript.
In all major modern browsers. So your V8s in Chrome and so on, it's supported.
Is jQuery
so jQuery is completely cross-compatible with Angular. Angular actually does this little thing when it loads up, which is quite cool. It says it has this little version of jQuery inside it, which they call jQuery Lite. And if jQuery has been loaded up already, it just ignores jQuery Lite and uses jQuery instead. So jQuery and Angular were sort of built from the ground up to cross-interact with each other.
Sorry, you said it uses its own jQuery. Are you told that you have to use a tag, like that HM, you said dash query or something? Or does it take precedence? Own jQuery engine to the jQuery.
So when I say they're cross-compatible, there's things like at times Angular will expect as an argument or return as a return value a jQuery object or a jQuery Lite object, depending on whether jQuery is loaded or not. So it's the sort of thing where jQuery makes Angular better, and Angular doesn't have to do a lot of things because jQuery does it for Angular.
So I can use jQuery and use jQuery straight away.
Yeah, absolutely. But if you don't have jQuery, then Angular kind of gives little bits of it to you anyway. So there's a compiler and a runtime. The runtime is kind of the important part because that's what gives you all of the cool data binding elements. I'm going to go into a little bit of detail, but I'm kind of going to skim through it because I'm aware of the time. The one thing I want everyone to know is about scopes. So scopes are kind of this little scary hump in the Angular learning curve where if you get them, it really helps you understand the mechanics of what's going on, and if you don't, you're kind of stuck in a little fiddly bit. So scopes are effectively the data model of Angular. They have methods exposed on them, apply and watch and so on, which allow you to plug into the data binding of Angular. Now, the reason you don't normally have to do this is because most of the things that Angular gives you give you the data binding for free. So what they're doing under the hood is they're calling these apply and watch methods that bind what you see to the value that's stored in these scopes. How familiar are people with MVC as a concept? Yeah. Okay, so I mean, for those of you who didn't raise your hands, MVC is basically this approach to engineering a system to design pattern, which says, well, on one hand we have the representation of our data, the model, and on one hand we have what people see, the view. So one might be a value between 1 and 100, which you represent as a slider. And the controller is kind of the interface between these two. In this case, the view is, your web page, it's what you see. Controllers are controllers in the Angular language, and the data model is for the better part scopes. So the other really important part about, so scopes store the value of what you're doing. The other really important part about scopes is they mimic the DOM. So they look like the DOM. They're anchored at places on the DOM. So if you talk about where your data is stored, you can point to an element in your HTML tree, and that is where the data exists, more or less. So this is an example of how the data binding works under the hood. I won't go into details about how the eval queue works in the digest loop and so on and so forth. The important thing to take away from this diagram is basically this sort of apply coming in and this watch going out. So if you look at the top, there's this $apply method, which is basically what JavaScript is using to communicate to Angular, hey, look, I want you to change your model to do this. And then there's the watch method, which is Angular telling the JS more or less, this is a value I want you to watch in case it changes. So in Angular, you can have things like curly braces name to say, replace this with whatever the value is of the name variable, like John showed you earlier. And what that's doing under the hood is saying, well, watch the name variable and substitute the value whenever it changes, essentially. So controllers, as I said, basically add behavior to a scope. So when you deal with something like when you create a controller in Angular, you might give it a method that says, display this variable or something like this, and this is callable from your HTML. So the controllers add functionality on top of a scope that would not normally be there. And the data that's underlying this controller, sort of in the JavaScript language, you would have the sort of prototype methods on the controller, and you would have whatever data is on your object that would live in the scope. Again, more or less, but I'm trying to give you a conceptual sort of working model for how these pieces fit together. Directives then are sort of your user interface glue and bits and pieces and widgets that let you do things. So some of these directives come built in. So I mean, some of them are coming built into HTML itself. So they're checkboxes and input fields and things like that Angular treats as directives. So for example, with the checkbox, Angular will sort of compile in various functionalities so that when you tick or untick it, it triggers an Angular event, and Angular is aware of that. And then there's examples of other directives that modify the DOM in various ways, so ng-show or things like that, that allow you to turn on and off elements in your DOM and things like that. So, and directives can hook into the scope. So if you say ng-show equals variable name, and that variable name then changes, you can have your element disappear or reappear. So you've got your directives, which sort of live in the HTML and hook into the controllers and scopes. And you've got your controllers, which expose sort of more functionality on top of the scope. And you've got the scopes, which store the actual data. Services we've already talked about. They kind of live in the back end and provide the functionality. So a good example of a service is, a service which talks to a server and actually makes calls out to that server. So here's an example of how it all fits together. And I appreciate that this is kind of overwhelming for those of you who haven't had a lot of Angular experience before. But it shows a few important things. One is how the scopes attached to the DOM. So you can see that there's a root scope at the very top, and this is kind of the ultimate, the base of all of the other scopes. And then building up over the DOM tree, which you see over the left, you can see that some of the elements, but not all, have various scopes attached to them. So you can see how the data kind of mimics the structure of your document, which gives you a good conceptual model for where does the data live. Now there's various subtleties, and the biggest one that will bite you is whether or not there is a scope at a particular point in the DOM. I'm not going to go into that too much, but if you read the documentation on directives and so on, there's some good information on how to know if not there is a scope on the DOM. John earlier talked about a guy called John Lindquist, I think it was, and he has some excellent tutorials which sort of do a bit of a deeper dive into and explain these things with code to show you sort of what happens when you turn on and off things. So, what does the compiler do then? So the way I like to think about the compiler is it's just there to set up all of the scopes. So the compiler is there to make sure that it sets up the scopes and the possibilities for data binding so that they're there later. There's two stages, compile and link. You don't need to worry too much about these, except for the compile stage happens before you've done any changes to the DOM, and the link stage happens after you've done any changes to the DOM. And the one case where it truly matters is in NGOP. So I'll try and show you an example of that later, but for the moment, you can almost think of them as the same stage. It's convenient. And finally, there's injection. Everything in Angular is injected, and this allows you to basically hook into anything, including the compiler itself, which is really great if you want to do cool stuff. If you're trying to write a big web app and you want to do some deferred compilation tricks, which is less necessary now with modules, but if you want to sort of dynamically generate your HTML, or if you've got a service serving you with angularized HTML that you then want to compile, you can do all of this. So basically every part of Angular is injected, including the injector. So you can do all of this crazy stuff if you want to dig in enough. The thing I love about Angular is that while it's very easy to get started, it's incredibly powerful if you want to actually dig into the guts of it. This is a rough diagram of how the initial compilation pass works. I won't go into it, but it's available on a website, Angular.JS Concepts, which I think I've linked here. I'll show all of these links again at the end of the talk. So this website is absolutely fantastic, basically to just go through everything I've said and a little bit more in terms of how the pieces of Angular fit together and how you can sort of conceptualize them. So it's got diagrams and an explanation of how all of these compiler passes work and things like that. If you're looking for a deeper understanding of Angular, can't recommend it enough. This is actually one of the things that's really improved since version 0.9 is the documentation is amazingly improved. So I wanted to do a brief detour into Closure Tools. So Closure Tools is a JS toolkit that we open sourced from Google about 3 years ago. It would have been around about the same time that Angular.js itself was coming out. Closure Tools are basically the tools we use for building large-scale web applications at Google. Is anyone here familiar with Closure Tools? Okay, more or less the people from Google are, obviously. Yeah. So if there is one thing you take away from this talk, and I say this in pretty much every talk, even if it's completely irrelevant, is that you should be using the Closure compiler. It is the best JS minifier, and it is the best JS minifier out there. It also provides a number of other things, such as compile time type checking and various other things that are critically important if you're building a large web app. But even if you're building a small web app, the fact that it's the best JS minifier means that the Closure compiler will make your JavaScript that much smaller and that much faster to download onto a client. So there's a few other benefits I'll get to as I kind of talk through it. So Closure compiler, extremely useful. There's a lot of resources about this. I won't go into too much detail about Clojure because it's its own fork. And it's basically the thing we use for building everything at Google. Every web app that Google builds uses Clojure. So how does Angular play with Clojure? Now this is a big question for us at Google because Clojure is kind of a fundamental part of all of our JavaScript development. I won't focus on the libraries, but I'll focus on the compiler because the compiler is really useful to every web developer, which the libraries aren't so much. So the thing about the compiler, it minifies JS. So basically it takes JS as input. It's a compiler in the sense that it takes JS as input and gives you JS as output. In order to figure out how to turn large JS, strip out the white space, rename variables and all of these things and turn it into small JS, it needs to know a bit about what's going on. So ideally, what the compiler should be able to do is it should take your JS, turn every web variable name that's not used directly, and turn it into something like A, or AB, or AC. And it should be able to take every piece of white space that's not used and clear it out. That's a pretty easy one. It should be able to take every function that's not called and remove it entirely, which if you're using big JavaScript libraries is amazingly helpful. So in order to tell the compiler how to do this and enable its full functionality, the various compilation levels, you need to tell it, okay, what can't you minify because I need to call it from outside, in this case Angular, or what does it need to know about that Angular is providing? So in the JS compiler language, these are called externs and exports. So exports are things that you say, hey, I need to call this from Angular, and externs are things you say, I need to call this because Angular has provided it to me. So we want to do something like this. This is the most bare bones thing you can do with Angular. You want to have a hello world method / variable that where the value is put into the DOM. So we might have a bit of JavaScript. Now this is a fairly abstruse bit of JavaScript, but you've got a controller, ns.mainControl, which is just, as I've said earlier, the unit of the functions that are exposed on your scope. So these are basically functions you can call for better or worse from the DOM. And you want to say, okay, I want to call this from the DOM, but I also want to compile my JavaScript so that instead of having this massively huge bit of JavaScript that takes up 6 lines, it'll even be pretty big once you've gzipped it. It'll be much smaller. So this is a tiny bit of a bad example because if the compiler is working as I think it does, it'll actually inline that bottom function. But assuming that doesn't happen, you want the compiled name to go down to something like A, and you want hello world to stay there so that you can actually call it from outside. So this is what @export does. So @export tells the compiler, don't mess with this, I know what I'm doing, you can minify anything else that you like, I just want you to preserve this name. And also importantly, you want it to preserve everything underneath that name, which requires a little bit of tweaking, but it's very well documented in the compiler docs. Extends is a little bit more complicated. And there's one major reason why I want to talk about this, because I don't think it's well known. So extends are easy enough if you just say, I want to call a method called Angular.element. They're much harder if you want to say, I want to call a method called Angular.element, and these are the objects I want to type check it for. So Clojure uses a JS doc type declaration thing, similar to JavaDoc if you've ever used JavaDoc, except Java obviously defines the types itself in the language. So this is a pain in the butt to write out, which is not really very pleasant, but you need to do it if you want to call any Angular functions from within your JavaScript that's going to be produced. So I'm happy to tell you that we've already done this for you. So the externs that you need to call Angular from within something that compiles are already open sourced at the URL. I only found this out today because it turns out that the directory we've been committing this code into happens to be regularly open sourced. So there you go. So we've open sourced it without me even knowing, which is great. So if you want to use Clojure Compiler with Angular, it works really, really well, and you should all be using it. One catch. Ryan is going to recognize this one. There is a bug in Angular, or at least there was at the time we wrote our code, which means that any variable with a $ is treated quite strangely by Angular's equality checking methods. It turns out this doesn't matter if you're naming your variables with traditional names like, hello world. It is a big problem if you compile it, because the compiler tries to use the smallest names possible. Some of those will have $. And it turns out these are badly handled by Angular. So you need to add this to your extends declaration as well. How am I going for time? Okay, I'll say a couple more things and then I'll just stop for questions. So Clojure library gives you a set of reusable things that you can use in your code. These aren't too different from jQuery in terms of the widgets you want to use. There's also a bunch of library methods, things which give you crypto functions and so on, if you happen to want to use them. The reason I wanted to talk about this particular pattern is because it's more generally applicable to wrapping any external library widget in Angular if you want to do it. So what I've done here is basically just grabbed a widget. In this case, the important line you're looking at for constructing the button is this new goog.button. I think it's actually goog.ui.button now that I think about it for the Clojure library, but regardless. And you see what we've done is we've grabbed the text off the element. So this is all in the link function. We've grabbed the text off the element. We reset the text so that it doesn't mess with that DOM anymore. We eval the text expression. And what that does is that says we want to get the current value of whatever expression we passed in, which grabs it off the scope, or the controller if we like. So it needn't be, so this can be a variable name that refers to something else, as opposed to just a string. And this is very much in sync with Angular's approach to most things. So if you put ng-hide equals blah, then blah will be treated as a variable to evaluate and not a string. So we've gone with the same thing here. And then we watch for changes on that, so that as the expression changes, or as the value of the expression changes, so if blah changes from foo to bar, that gets picked up and shown as the text on the button. So all we've done here is we've taken one of our buttons and wrapped it as an Angular directive. There's a few other things to pick up in here in terms of how the directive is declared. But the important part here is how we've wrapped the button. You'll also notice that I've made a reference to the link function, which is exactly the same as the link function I talked about earlier. So this basically says, when the compiler gets to this DOM node, wrap the button in an element, put it back in the DOM. And now Angular understands it, which is really important because it means we've just created a data-bound button, where it previously was just a piece of JavaScript that we would import in a library. Okay, that was a pretty complex example. Does anyone have any questions just about that in particular? So in this case, it's listening to the Angular expression, text expression. So it's not listening to DOM manipulation events unless something in the evaluation of that expression would happen to listen to it, because Angular has kind of this loop thing that turns out. But an example of an expression would be more like a function you would call, or a value of a variable that's on the controller. And traditionally that would be just return string or something similarly simple. But it could listen to DOM events ultimately. So? That's quite probable. I didn't run this before testing. Basically, this has been lifted out of our code and semi-obfuscated. Well, not obfuscated so much as minified to fit on the slide. So yeah, I would completely understand if I've stuffed this up a little bit. So I'm sorry.
Element 0.
Right. That is because element is a jQuery element, and so I've got the because the jQuery selector might return a set of elements. This gets the underlying DOM element from the jQuery element.
can't have a 1, 2, 3. For instance,
No, it will. In this case, it will always be a single element. I'm pretty sure.
I think you can.
So for jQuery selectors, it's going to return multiple elements. So if you were to select elements by class in your jQuery, then an element could have multiple returns. But in this particular example, where we're going through the compiler, it's only one.
You had the testable aspect of the device, but I've faced some issues when trying to test directives because quite often there is another DOM in there. So do you have any kind of recommended best practices on how do we go about testing this?
Yeah, absolutely. We ran into exactly the same problem. The approach we ended up taking, which was quite effective. Actually, I should take a step back. In Google, normally we write things in almost pure JavaScript. It's similar to the way you construct things in jQuery.js, like for directives. And so the way Google.button is tested is pretty much in pure JS for the most part. What we found for directives testing is we just create a fake HTML page with a single directive on it and essentially do a UI test of it. So in this case, for this button, we would create a button on a page with an expression to watch, and then Puppet tested in our case, or WebDriver tested, or something along these lines. That's the most effective way we found. Because it's only the single directive, it's sort of like a UI unit test rather than testing the whole app, which is nice. Okay. The other thing that's cool is if you want to add event handlers that sort of propagate through. And so the code I'm showing you now essentially says, okay, well, if we create a button with a button directive in our DOM, and then we say NSAction equals some expression, so NSAction equals, var equals var plus 1, then when the button is clicked, which is what the action event does, it'll trigger that event. So what we've done is we've taken this JavaScript object where normally we would say new button.add listener function that does something, and then button.render DOM element to get it in there. Instead, all we have to do is put this little snippet in our actual declarative HTML that says button action equals do something. And that's a hell of a lot better. Oh, you also see the scope.apply here, which basically does the opposite of the scope.watch we saw on the previous slide. The scope.well, more or less the opposite of the scope.eval. So the scope.apply in this case says apply this action, but make sure the result of the action is applied to the value on the scope. And that means that Angular will be able to pick it up. You have to make sure to use scope.apply when you want to do these things, otherwise the data model strange things can happen with the data model. But this basically makes sure that your data model stays in sync. So if you have anything listening to the thing you're trying to modify, like you click the button and it increments a variable, then that incremented value will get picked up by the other part of your app.
Excuse me. So the result will come back on that button, is it?
So in this case, you could attach whatever event you liked. So this is a button that you could click, it could open a pop-up, or you could click it and it could assign a new value to a variable. And the point is, say that you had on NSAction equals some variable equals hello world. Then when you click the button, if you have another text box that's showing the value of that variable, that text box would now show hello world when you click the button. And the scope.apply makes sure that Angular knows how to connect those two things. Yeah.
On that slide previously, in your watch callback, it says $button get on.
Yes.
That's a jQuery like most for button, is it?
Yes. So button being a goog.ui.button element, so this is the closure idiom. Button.get element says get me the DOM element from the closure button. So it's basically the same abstraction as Angular uses, just backwards.
Do you need to select the element there, or what's the difference between doing that and just going button dot get element dot text? Sending it text that way.
Do DOM elements have a .text method that does that?
That's jQuery.
Right. Okay. So that would have been why we did that.
Alright.
Yeah. 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 So unfortunately, I don't have the entire HTML spec in my head, but yeah. So that would have been why we did that. That jQuery selected that way.
The whole NS action thing, like driving binding to specific events or things like that.
Mm-hmm.
Why would you go to the effort of doing that? Angular already has a suite of interactive like NG with that. So what's the benefit of writing your own directory?
So this is a particularly naive example. In particular, the closure button is just a button. Like, I mean, if you were to take your own button and style it like a closure button, like you see on Google pages, you wouldn't notice the difference, and you could just use ngClick. But Clojure has its own event system that's threaded throughout the Clojure libraries, and this technique will apply to any of those elements. So it's I've just chosen a naive example because it's there and it's simple. Yeah. Okay. 7:37. How are people feeling? I've got 2-3 more. Yeah, there's only a couple more things to say. This is a really neat trick. It's mostly a Clojure compiler trick, but it allows you to do introspection in Angular, which is really cool. So because Clojure compiler does dead code elimination, if you compile with the debug flag, you can use that to either include or exclude debug JavaScript from your code. What that means is if you want to have debug code in your code, but you don't want it to get exposed to your users, you can do things like this in order to include it. And so the example I've got here allows you to hook into the link function in order to do this. This is much less useful now that Batarang is around, and you can do some sort of much cooler deep introspection into your JavaScript as it's running. But it comes in useful if you want to do some sort of custom profiling or things like that in order to eliminate things. So I'll show an example in a couple of slides of how we use this, or more specifically how Ryan has used this. So this is how we do internationalization. I don't know how relevant internationalization is to a few of you, but this is kind of an interesting trick, so I thought it's worth mentioning. So if you take a hop into our code and you actually look at some of our HTML, you'll notice it's marked up in a bit of a strange way. And there are these things which say .lm message, .lm desk everywhere. So what we have is a script that runs over this, pulls the strings out and sends them for translation, which is interesting enough. And so the Angular implementation of this, of .lm message and .lm desk, is essentially a no, because, well, it's two parts. So desk we can ignore. First of all, there's a debug thing. And the reason we have this debug thing is because we encountered bugs while we were trying to do this, and we wanted to have a way of introspecting how our translations were being put back into our data. So that's kind of a neat trick. So this is how we used the debug flag in order to sort of hook a little logging thing into there. There's some other stuff that happens in there, but that's just an example of how you use it. The additional thing we do is when we're sending the messages back down to the client, we just send the original HTML, and then Angular swaps out the messages for us. So if you go into our Russian interface, you don't really notice the difference. But what's happened is Angular has got to the message in the DOM, gone, oh, this isn't meant to be translated. Where's the Russian version of the translations? We only send down the Russian version, obviously, if you're trying to do Russian, and swaps it in. I can't remember for the life of me why we don't just compile it in, but at any rate, it's an interesting trick that might give you a few ideas.
But actually, it's a white message. Then after provides message.
Sorry? Oh, how do I call it?
Yeah.
So it's a directive. There's a way of assigning directives to points on the DOM, and ultimately this ns.localized message gets assigned to data lm message or data ns message in this case. So there's a directive binding language. Okay, and that's all I had to say. I think we're about over time. Yeah, any questions?
Just back to that code. So will the closure compiler out all the code?
Yeah. So the trick that's important is that NSDebug has to be compiled in. So it has to be set to false, like in a explicit script tag as it's being compiled. You can't just set like variable NSDebug on the client like in real time, because obviously then the code will still be downloaded. Yeah.
I have a question about it, not directly related to tonight, but nested views with the route. So I've finally reached the point where I have sort of 2 layers of navigation and only have one engine.
Unfortunately, we've not run into this problem. I don't know if there's anyone else here who can help.
Sort of done that as well, but I've just boxed it right. Right. That's the solution I just want to stack.
I mean, the way I build it up on HTML being inclusive, all the control view by itself every time. With the ng include.
Yeah, in our
you look at the forums and see a lot of
in our case, we I don't know if we have anything that would call for that at any rate, but we use our own sort of history tracking and routing mechanism. So yeah, there's only a limited we wouldn't have hit it. So we use Google.history, for example, for our history tracking, which is the closure library thing, rather than routing back and forward.
I've got probably a more general question. Is just what is happening in the mobile space? Because I don't know if you put a lot of money on web pages. So mobile apps and that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Where's this going?
I know there's a lot of mobile-specific frameworks which are coming out now that seem to be very popular. I've fetched most of the names out of my head, but there's a lot of discussion at OSCON about all of these cool new mobile frameworks. I think, and I was talking to someone about this earlier, Angular.js is going to struggle on mobile because A, the bootstrap is really large. I just checked it this afternoon and it was 78 kilobytes for the Angular.js minified version. And the second problem is that it's kind of memory intensive, which on desktop and IE 8 Plus and every other browser doesn't bother you too much, but on mobile browsers, I think it was you that was saying that, yeah, it's slow.
If you take that into something like PhoneGap or that, it might be really, does it?
Sorry,
If you take it into PhoneGap or something like that, it doesn't really matter how big it is to download pretty quick.
And also it depends how many elements they have on your codes there to compile.
Yeah, the thing is, if you do like ng includes, you've got very limited amount of HTML.
Yeah.
A single metadata. Like, there doesn't seem to be any push from the Angular team anyway to be anything mobile.
I think that's true. I mean, I haven't spoken to them about mobile specifically because ours being a sort of enterprise business management thing doesn't hit the mobile space. So I haven't noticed them doing anything. The one thing I will say is that the performance, Angular performance seems to be constrained on 2 things. One is like how performant your browser and system is, and the other one is the number of data bindings in the DOM. So if you have a simple web page, it might be okay on mobile, but if you have like a table like we're doing where pretty much every cell in the table is found, then you're going to hit problems.
I looked at the policy and you can use Angular for like emails. And I think so on mobile, we haven't really focused much on mobile. Mobile website, pretty much just the website. And like recently I feel a little bit more like very faster than I think that will get it more usable. I found that like more the lack of direct use to things like that. And I think it's more issues that will be nice to do.
Yeah, I mean, my friends are in touch. Well,
yeah, it's like
touch to it, but I think we really that's 300 milliseconds delay.
UI.
But there's the widgets and that kind of stuff. Whereas these like IUI and all these other libraries, got all the widgets. CSS help.
Yes.
Avoid
I
that.
think with performance, I found more it was to sort of DOM being so heavy rather than JavaScript. So, I mean, like, yeah, that's doing some heavy GL, and stuff. And DOM just so heavy that they call me like frequency because I'm afraid that it doesn't know stuff. But,
I mean, we also did something similar where we had a quite a heavy page. We actually rewrote it to be mobile. So instead of having like a table, we had a equivalent of a list. Rather than a table and stuff.
So what's your biggest problem developing on
It's
mobile
just
at
that
the moment?
it doesn't seem to be any direction for Angular in mobile. I've asked the question a few times.
Yeah, my take on that is it's Angular in time now. It's quite young. It's kind of like where jQuery was before the jQuery sort of companion UI frameworks were. So if you just want to live in the jQuery world, you would probably choose jQuery Mobile, right? Which is great. But it's a very popular widget framework for mobile. It is very slow. I agree. But it exists. There is a project called Angular UI, which is kind of a mix of various components. It's not really complete, but I think you'll see it come along. I mean, I'm using it for my mobile web app. It is a bit slow for complex pages, but it does work okay. And I mean, the real benefit is, like you're saying, you can build a site, one code base and target mobile and desktop, with some responsive design, and you've got it. But yeah, with my team, the hard work at the moment is all the UI and widget building. We're doing a lot of it by hand, taking jQuery, like widgets built for jQuery and converting them. So.
Tab right at the bottom.
Yeah. And this technique of wrapping existing widgets in directives, that's kind of key to making that happen. That's the fast way to get them working out of the box.
Yeah, so if anyone wants to refer to these things afterwards, just to take code and so on, I'll post these, or I'll get John to post these the slides somewhere.
Okay, so
Let's.
one more question. Yep.
Yeah. How do you propagate scope data inside with multiple nested controllers? You have control like effectively directive in a directive and indirective, and then you can both share data. Well, the department is on the top one, and then all the findings is nested.
So you can share one way, but not the other. Is the problem that scopes can refer to, or you can refer to scopes above where you live, but not below where you live. That's kind of the problem you're getting at.
Yeah, I'm not sure if that's a problem. I just wonder if it's a better way of doing that. Because I'm just getting the parent scope and just assigning data to that one.
Yeah,
Is,
that's roughly what we've done when we've run into similar-ish problems. We haven't run into too many similar problems. I know there's things people have talked about. Actually, do forms still exist in V1? I'm not sure that they do.
Yep.
They still exist? Yeah, we don't use them. But I know when we were on V10, the way people were simulating this sort of stuff was with nested forms, because forms naturally need to refer up and down scopes in order to do validation. But I don't know if that helps in your particular case.
it's a bit lazy. Notifications. Yeah. That's I think most traffic services where you store that outside, we had issues with services kind of like Singleton, and you kind of had multiple instances of these various controllers couldn't use the service anymore unless you wanted to start dealing with lifecycle control. That's I think you can listen into like the scope destroyer structures and stuff like that. It sounds really messy, so we ended up just pretty much we wanted to have, I guess, even just have sibling controls talk to each other. We ended up just firing from the root scope notifications down to everything because of the season. And then
Does that work around that? With NGView as well, I tried that with NGView. I was trying to bring in different controls, but every time you bring it in, previous controls start trying to notify the other one when I pick up.
There does seem to be a sort of line you have to walk between controllers and services in the sort of sense that occasionally you'll want a bunch of controllers to share something, but you won't want to make it a service because obviously it's not a singleton. So you kind of go, oh, hang on, I've got this gap and I want to refer to this scope over there. And yeah, so maybe the ultimate answer is just try and grab stuff from the parent scope or use notifications to pass stuff around and lump it. Thanks very much.
Okay, so thanks, Daniel. Let's give Daniel a hand. Hands up if you have a copy of this book, if you want a copy.
It's also.
All right, so if you wouldn't mind not answering these questions, it will give the people that don't own a copy a chance to win it. So this is a bit of a Bible for JavaScript programming. If you've heard of Douglas Crockford from Yahoo, to my thinking, he's the guy that raised the awareness of JavaScript as the awesome language that it is, and sort of kicked off a lot of the Web 2.0 and sort of JavaScript ninja stuff. John Resick, who did jQuery, was at Yahoo as well, so you know, a few of his. This is a great book to have. So, do you have any questions for the audience, Daniel? All right, I've got a few.
Sorry.
So who'd like to win a copy of the book? All right, come on out, please. Stand up, come up to the stage, and be at the mercy. Now, come on, there must be more than one. Come on. Are you a serious JavaScript developer or what? We need more than 3 people. Come on, you're going to be in it to win it.
I hope it's about knockout.
What's that?
I hope the question's about knockout. Well, I'm dating. Who's going to be behind the wall?
Okay, so do you mind just quickly introducing yourself? So your name, where you're from, and what you're doing, if anything, with Angular. Oh, and actually, do you mind if I record your faces? I need to get your permission, otherwise I can't do it.
As long as it's just above nothing.
Just below the head.
Is that okay? It's a serious question? Yeah, okay, good, thank you. All right, go ahead.
Hi, I'm Andrew Hodson. I'm from the UK, and I haven't used Angular for anything actually, but I use Knockout, which is kind of similar.
Yep.
I'm Michael Hills. I work at Posse, which is a startup where you can kind of add your favorite places to go and share that with your friends, and use the site as like a search tool to find places to go. So we've been using Angular since at least January. That's when I started there. Yeah, we've been using it quite some time now. I think been pretty good for us. We've also had a lot of pain with it, so that's why I'm here, I guess.
My name is Felix Chandraviba. We've been, well, I'm primarily a Ruby on Rails developer. We have a desktop client that's built on AngularJS. So we're trying to transition from AngularJS/Flex to Model.js. So AngularJS feels really like Flex in a way. So, you know, good for us.
Okay, good. Alex, can I ask you to be the judge or the adjudicator? We're gonna ask questions. We don't have bells, so first one to raise their hand, you need to tell me who put their hand up first and get to answer the question first. All right. You might want to sit up here so that.
So there's no parallax errors.
I'd have an advantage. Yeah.
And so the audience, so your role here. I've got a couple of questions, but not enough. first person to get 5 questions right wins the book. All right. A hand up and a wrong answer will lose them a point. Okay, it could. That's why. So please. So think of some questions that are about Daniel or my talk that are reasonable questions that if these 3 contestants were listening, they would know. Okay, with me? And Daniel, I'm sure you'll have some too. All right. Alex, ready?
Ready.
Okay. So do you know them? You call out their names. Andrew, Michael, and Felix. Okay. So first question. In Angular, what are scopes?
Andrew.
So scopes are when you declare in the markup, something's within. It's got ng, and everything within that is within that scope, within that element. Is that right? Sorry, I think it's like knockout. It'll be the same as that.
I think it's fair to say this might be a knockout for you. Can we have Daniel can be the adjudicator here. Give us a crisp definition of the scope in Angular. I'll give you one more chance, Andrew.
No, that's what I've got.
What do you think of that answer? No. All right, we won't lose your point. We'll give the other 2 a chance to answer.
So it's not totally wrong.
Michael was second.
Pretty much the data model that I guess a controller can manipulate, then the view can use that data or can display that data.
I'm happy with that answer?
Yeah.
Yes, I think so. Okay.
I can test the question.
Knockout questions. No, I don't. Okay. What is the closure compiler used for?
Minifying your code.
Yeah. How well does it do it? Bonus question.
Is this 2 points?
Really, really well.
Really, really well.
Yeah.
I think that was verbatim what I said. Okay, well done. So we're one each. Okay, who's got a question? Because I only had 2.
We may have to just make it first 2.
All right, we'll make it first to 3. Yep. Peter?
What would you pick Angular.JS compared to the other similar JavaScript engines?
Felix.
That's right.
I didn't hear that. What was the answer?
That's the adjudicator.
That was the answer given, so I guess. All right, 1 each. Well done. A for narcissism. All right.
Where does the work at? Where does it work?
Felix.
Yahoo.
Doesn't work there anymore.
He doesn't work there now, does he?
Yeah, it doesn't work.
Doesn't work there anymore.
All right. I
Something
kind
about the
of wanted the
extra
questions to be
Can I ask a question?
about
You're allowed to answer.
no, you cannot answer a question. So thanks for the offer. I've got questions about the talk. Yep.
Can you send Ajax questions actually?
Did we cover that?
Well, yeah, you did actually. You mentioned it.
Okay. Who answered that?
Michael.
And the answer was yes. That's an easy point. All right. Okay. Yep. There was another question here.
Yeah. What would you define if you wanted to extend HTML?
Yes, that's a good question. Good answer. So
1 to 2.
1, 2, 2. All right. Okay, this could be the decider. All right. So, yeah, do you have a good question? For another question? Is it about the talk?
Yes.
Yeah? Difficult question? Okay, go ahead.
So someone asked about Ajax. what are the two ways to do those meetups?
Like,
HTTP service and the resource.
Yeah. All right. We have a winner. Well done, Michael. So thank you to O'Reilly. They send me a lot of books for these meetups, so please support them and well done, enjoy.
Thank you. I've actually been meaning to get this, so thanks a lot.
Okay, so that about wraps it up. Thank you very much for coming. I'll be following up and asking for feedback and speakers as well. Like I said, we'll do this each month, and hopefully we've got ourselves a really interesting and worthwhile meetup to come along. Thanks to Google. Thanks, Alex, for your time. Thanks, Daniel, for speaking. Thank you, Google, for sponsoring us with the venue and the pizza. And there's more pizza. Yeah, great. So we'll see you next month. Thanks again.